The evening sun cast a golden hue over the bustling city streets as 35-year-old Maria Jenkins walked briskly toward her car. She had just finished her grocery shopping and was mentally preparing for the week ahead. Maria, a distinguished black woman with an air of quiet confidence, was known for her calm demeanor and sharp intellect. What most people didn't know, however, was her role as one of the youngest judges in the state, a detail she didn't feel the need to flaunt. She had worked hard to earn her place in the courtroom, overcoming countless hurdles and proving her worth time and time again. As she loaded the last bag into her car, she noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser pulling into the parking lot. She thought nothing of it at first, but as the two officers stepped out and made their way toward her, she felt a sudden unease settle in the pit of her stomach. "Ma'am, could you step away from the vehicle?" one of the officers, a burly man with a hardened expression, demanded. His tone was clipped, almost hostile. Confused, Maria complied. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area." The second officer chimed in, his eyes scanning her car as though expecting to uncover some incriminating evidence. Maria's heart sank. She had heard of incidents like this happening to others, stories of racial profiling and unwarranted harassment. But she never imagined she would find herself in such a situation. "Suspicious activity?" Maria repeated, her brow furrowing. "I was just grocery shopping. Is there a problem with that?" The first officer stepped closer, his posture intimidating. "We'll be the ones asking the questions, ma'am," he said curtly. Without waiting for her response, he gestured toward her car. "Open the trunk." Maria hesitated. "Do you have a warrant for that?" she asked, her voice now tinged with defiance. Her question seemed to agitate the officers. The second cop smirked, crossing his arms. "Lady, are you resisting? Because that's not going to end well for you." Before she could respond, they had her in handcuffs, their justification vague and their demeanor increasingly hostile. A small crowd began to gather, some filming the incident on their phones, while others murmured among themselves about the unfairness of what they were witnessing. Maria didn't resist as they led her to the patrol car, her mind racing. She knew better than to escalate the situation, but her frustration boiled just beneath the surface. She thought of her years of studying law, her late nights poring over case files, and her countless hours on the bench ensuring justice was served fairly. Now, here she was, treated like a criminal without cause. As the car pulled away, the officers exchanged smug looks, clearly unaware of who they had just arrested. "Guess she thought she was above the law," one of them muttered. Maria remained silent, her gaze fixed on the window. She wasn't above the law, but she was very much a part of it, and they were about to find out exactly how. The next morning, the officers arrived at court to testify about the suspicious activity that had led to the arrest. They walked into the courtroom, their heads held high, confident in their authority. But as they took their seats and waited for the judge to arrive, the room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the door as Maria entered, her judge's robe flowing behind her. The officers' smug expressions dissolved into shock and disbelief as they realized who was about to preside over their case. "Good morning, gentlemen," Maria said, her voice steady and authoritative. "Let's begin." The air in the courtroom was electric, filled with tension and anticipation. And at that moment, it became clear the tables had turned, and justice was about to take its rightful place. The courtroom was unnervingly silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the clicking of pens from the gallery. Maria Jenkins, now seated confidently behind the bench, scanned the room with a calm but firm gaze. She could see the two officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their previous bravado noticeably absent. Maria let the silence linger, a deliberate choice that magnified the gravity of the moment. "Officers Daniels and Carter," she began, her voice even and measured. "I understand you were involved in an incident yesterday evening that resulted in the arrest of an individual on suspicion of... Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's start with the facts. Please, walk me through the events that led to this case." Daniels, the older and more senior officer, cleared his throat. His usual air of authority faltered slightly as he glanced at his partner, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Your Honor, we were responding to a call about suspicious activity in a supermarket parking lot. When we arrived, we observed the defendant standing near her vehicle. She appeared to be evasive. Maria's lips twitched, but she maintained her composure. Evasive? She echoed. Can you elaborate on what behavior struck you as evasive, Officer Daniels? Daniels hesitated, clearly fumbling for words. She, seemed nervous when we approached. And when we asked to search her vehicle, she questioned our authority. Maria leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. Question your authority, or exercise her legal right to inquire whether you had a warrant. Carter, the younger officer, interjected hastily. Your Honor, it's standard procedure for us to investigate when there's a call about suspicious behavior. We were just doing our job. Of course, Maria replied, her voice steady but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. But surely you understand that the law requires probable cause or a warrant before conducting a search, particularly when the individual in question explicitly denies consent. Or is that not something covered in your training? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Maria allowed a moment for her words to settle before continuing. Let's put that aside for now. I'd like to hear more about this call. Who reported the alleged suspicious activity, and what exactly did they claim to have witnessed? Daniels shuffled through his notes, clearly stalling. It was an anonymous tip, he admitted reluctantly. Maria's eyebrows lifted slightly. An anonymous tip, she repeated. No specifics, no first-hand account, just a vague report of suspicious activity. Did you verify this information before making an arrest? Carter leaned forward, his voice defensive. With all due respect, Your Honor, we acted in good faith. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of time to verify every detail when public safety is at risk. Maria's gaze hardened, and her voice dropped to a quieter, more deliberate tone. Public safety. Was there a weapon? A threat of violence? Anything that posed an immediate danger to the public in that parking lot last night? Carter opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, realizing he had no satisfactory answer. The tension in the room thickened, every eye fixed on the officers as they struggled to defend their actions. Meanwhile, Maria's mind was racing. She remembered every moment of the encounter vividly, the dismissive tone, the unnecessary force, the humiliating experience of being handcuffed in front of strangers. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about something much bigger. Accountability. She turned her attention back to Daniels. You mentioned that the defendant seemed nervous. Tell me, Officer Daniels, if you were approached by two armed men accusing you of criminal activity without cause, how would you feel? Daniels swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. I'll take that as a rhetorical question, Maria continued. Now let's talk about what happened after the arrest. You placed her in the back of your vehicle and took her to the station. What was the charge? The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniels fumbled with his words. Well, we charged her with obstruction. Obstruction, Maria said flatly. Obstruction of what exactly? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. She was uncooperative. She questioned our actions and refused to comply. Maria's tone sharpened. Refused to comply with an unlawful request. If a citizen exercises their constitutional rights, is that considered obstruction in your book, Officer Daniels? The tension in the room was now unbearable, the officers visibly squirming under Maria's scrutiny. Carter finally broke the silence, his voice quieter this time. We made a judgment call, Your Honor. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but we were trying to do the right thing. Maria leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She studied the two men carefully, noting their discomfort but also their stubborn refusal to fully acknowledge their misconduct. You know, she began, her voice softer now but no less commanding. I've spent years on this bench, listening to countless cases involving people who made judgment calls. Some of them were wrong, some of them were harmful, and some of them had devastating consequences. But here's the thing, when you wear that badge, your responsibility is to the law, not your instincts. And when you fail to honor that responsibility, you don't just fail the individuals you target, you fail the entire system. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Maria could feel the eyes of the gallery on her, some filled with admiration, others with quiet outrage on her behalf. But she wasn't done yet. There was more to uncover, more questions to ask, and more truths to bring to light. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every voice that had been silenced, and every moment where justice had been denied. And as Maria sat there, staring down the two officers who had so casually disregarded her rights, she knew one thing for certain: this case was far from over. The gavel hadn't dropped yet, and the story was only just beginning. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, Maria took a steadying breath. Her mind was clear, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. She wasn't just confronting two officers, she was challenging an entire system of unchecked authority, one that far too often left people like her behind. Maria turned her focus to the court clerk, her voice calm but resolute. "Clerk, please read the charges brought against the defendant, including the evidence submitted to support those claims." The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, stood and began reading from the file. As the details were laid out, the weaknesses in the officer's case became painfully clear. No concrete evidence of a crime, no physical threat observed, and no corroborating statements from any witnesses. It all hinged on the vague notion of suspicious behavior and a thinly veiled assumption rooted in bias. Maria's fingers lightly tapped against the bench as she listened, her thoughts briefly drifting to the people in her life who had warned her that rising through the ranks as a Black woman in law would mean facing battles like this. But she hadn't let those warnings deter her. If anything, they had fueled her determination. When the clerk finished, Maria directed her gaze back to the officers. "So, just to summarize, you arrested a woman with no prior criminal record, no evidence of wrongdoing, and no legal grounds for a search, because she seemed evasive. Is that correct?" Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we don't have the luxury of hindsight when we're in the field. We make decisions based on the information we have at the time." Maria nodded slowly, her expression neutral. "I understand that, Officer Carter, but hindsight is exactly what the justice system is for, to examine those decisions and determine whether they were lawful and just. And right now, the evidence doesn't paint a flattering picture." Daniels, who had been silent for much of the hearing, finally spoke up. His tone was defensive, almost defiant. "Your Honor, we put our lives on the line every day to protect this community. Mistakes might happen, but we don't deserve to be vilified for doing our jobs." Maria held his gaze, unflinching. "No one is vilifying you, Officer Daniels, but accountability is not vilification. It's the cornerstone of justice. And if you can't tell the difference, then perhaps it's time to reconsider the badge you wear." The tension in the room thickened as the officers bristled under her words. But Maria didn't falter. She wasn't here to coddle egos. She was here to uphold the law. Outside the courtroom, the story had already begun to spread. Clips of Maria being arrested, captured on cell phones by bystanders, had gone viral overnight. Social media was ablaze with outrage, support, and debate. Some hailed Maria as a hero for standing up to the officers, while others questioned whether her position as a judge gave her an unfair advantage in the situation. Maria's best friend and confidant Erica had called her that morning, her voice full of concern. "You know they're going to spin this however they want, right?" Erica had said. "They'll make you the bad guy if they think it'll save face." Maria had sighed, knowing Erica was right. "Let them spin it," she had replied. "The truth has a way of cutting through the noise." Now, as Maria presided over the hearing, she could feel the weight of the outside world pressing against the courtroom walls. This wasn't just about her and the officers anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger, a battle over justice, fairness, and the systemic issues that continue to plague law enforcement. But amidst the tension, another thread of the story began to unfold. In the gallery sat a man in his late 50s, dressed in a modest suit. His name was Samuel Carter, and he was Officer Carter's father. Samuel had spent his own career in law enforcement, retiring as a respected detective after nearly 30 years of service. As he watched the proceedings, Samuel's face was etched with a mix of concern and quiet shame. He had raised his son to value integrity and justice, but seeing Carter's actions laid bare in the courtroom made him question where he had gone wrong. After the hearing adjourned for a recess, Samuel approached Maria in the hallway. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hesitant but sincere, "may I have a word?" Maria turned, surprised to see the older man. "Of course," she said, her tone cautious. Samuel glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I don't mean to interfere, but I need you to know that not all of us wear that badge the way my son did last night. What he did, it's not how I taught him. And it's not how the system is supposed to work." Maria studied him carefully, noting the earnestness in his expression. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Carter, but actions speak louder than apologies. If you want to make a difference, talk to your son. Teach him what accountability looks like." Samuel nodded slowly, her words clearly striking a chord. "You're right," he said, "and I will. But I also want you to know that there are officers out there who want to do better, who need leaders like you to hold us accountable so we can be better." Maria didn't respond immediately. She had spent years grappling with the complexities of law enforcement and the justice system. Samuel's words were a reminder that the system wasn't monolithic. It was made up of individuals, each with the potential to change. As the recess ended and the hearing resumed, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about confronting the officers who had wronged her. It was about shining a light on the cracks in the system and pushing for the change that so many desperately needed. But even as she pressed forward, Maria knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The officers were unlikely to admit fault, and the public debate would only grow louder. The story wasn't over, and the conflict was far from resolved. But Maria was prepared for the fight, because justice wasn't just a principle to her. It was a promise she had made to herself, her community, and everyone who believed in the power of truth. And she wasn't about to break that promise now. As the hearing continued, the air in the courtroom grew heavier with every passing moment. Maria's steady voice filled the room as she meticulously dissected every action taken by Officers Daniels and Carter. She pointed out the discrepancies in their testimonies, the gaps in their reasoning, and the alarming lack of evidence to justify the arrest. The officers, once so confident, now seemed to shrink with each question, their defenses crumbling under the weight of the truth. But this wasn't just about proving them wrong. Maria knew that exposing their actions was only one piece of the puzzle. The larger issue, the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to persist, was the real challenge. And as the tension in the courtroom mounted, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting to see how she would handle the growing storm. Then, a new twist emerged. A young woman in her early 20s, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, nervously raised her hand from the gallery. She had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, her face a mix of hesitation and determination. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "may I speak?" Maria paused, studying the woman for a moment before nodding. "State your name for the record and explain your connection to this case." The woman stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My name is Lisa Martinez. I was in the parking lot that night. I saw what happened." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Maria motioned for Lisa to approach the stand. "Ms. Martinez, please share what you witnessed." Lisa took a deep breath before beginning. "I was sitting in my car, waiting for my friend, when I noticed the officers approached the defendant's vehicle. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I saw how they were talking to her, how they were acting. It didn't feel right. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She just seemed confused and scared." "Did you record any of this interaction?" Maria asked, her tone careful but hopeful. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I did. I didn't know if it would be important, but I thought someone should document it." Maria's heart raced. This could be a turning point. "Do you have the recording with you?" Lisa pulled out her phone and handed it to the bailiff, who quickly brought it to the court clerk. Within moments, the video was playing on the courtroom's large screen. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show the officers' aggressive demeanor as they approached Maria. Their tone was sharp, their body language intimidating. The recording captured the entire exchange, including Maria's calm and reasonable questions about their authority to search her vehicle, and their dismissive, condescending responses. The room was silent as the video played, the tension building with every second. When it ended, Maria turned her gaze to the officers. "Officers Daniels and Carter, do you have anything to say about what we've just seen?" Daniels clenched his jaw, his face flushed with anger. "It's easy to take things out of context," he muttered. "Context," Maria repeated, her voice cold. "What context could possibly justify this behavior?" Carter, looking visibly shaken, leaned forward. "Your Honor, we didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. Maybe we misread the situation, but we were trying to follow protocol." "Protocol?" Maria's voice rose slightly, her frustration finally breaking through. "What part of your training teaches you to ignore a citizen's rights, to dismiss their questions, and to escalate without cause? Because if that's protocol, then we have a much bigger problem on our hands." The courtroom was electric now, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. Maria took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "Ms. Martinez," she said, turning back to the young woman, "thank you for your bravery in coming forward. Your testimony and evidence will be critical as we move forward." Lisa nodded, a hint of relief in her expression as she returned to her seat. But just as Maria thought she had control of the situation, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a sharp suit strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. It was Assistant Chief Howard, a high-ranking official in the police department. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm but firm, "may I address the court?" Maria's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew Howard by reputation, a man known for his charm and political savvy, but also for his ability to deflect criticism from his department. "Proceed," she said, her voice cautious. Howard stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "First, let me express my gratitude for the court's dedication to uncovering the truth. I want to assure you, Your Honor, and everyone present, that we take these allegations very seriously. The actions of our officers do not reflect the values of our department." Maria's jaw tightened. She had heard speeches like this before, polished words designed to appease the public without enacting real change. "With all due respect, Assistant Chief Howard," she said, her tone sharp, "this isn't about public relations. It's about accountability. Words are meaningless without action." Howard nodded, his smile tight. "I couldn't agree more, Your Honor, which is why I've initiated an internal investigation into this incident. Rest assured, we will take appropriate action once the investigation is complete." Maria stared at him, unblinking. "And in the meantime, what do you plan to do to ensure this doesn't happen again tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that?" Howard hesitated, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge. "We're committed to reviewing our training protocols and addressing any deficiencies," he said finally. Maria's eyes narrowed. "I hope you're prepared to back those commitments with tangible results, Assistant Chief, because empty promises won't fix this." The tension in the room reached its breaking point as Howard nodded stiffly and took a seat. Maria could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the eyes of the gallery watching her every move. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a battle for justice, for accountability, for the truth. And as Maria looked around the courtroom, she knew one thing for certain. The climax was approaching, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was still, tension hanging in the air like a thick fog after Maria's pointed exchange with Assistant Chief Howard. Everyone could sense the stakes were climbing, yet few could have anticipated what came next. Just as Maria prepared to move forward with the proceedings, her clerk hurriedly approached the bench, whispering something that made Maria's expression shift ever so slightly. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked softly, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk replied, her tone urgent. "It just came through." Maria nodded, motioning for the clerk to return to her seat. Turning her attention back to the room, she addressed the gallery. "Before we proceed, new evidence has been submitted to the court. I'll allow a brief recess to review it, and we'll reconvene shortly." The room buzzed with speculation as Maria exited to her chambers. Whatever had just surfaced wasn't part of anyone's script, and the uncertainty only heightened the tension. Once inside her chambers, Maria opened the file handed to her by the clerk. Her breath caught as she scanned the documents. These weren't just random new details, they were personnel files for Officers Daniels and Carter, accompanied by internal complaints that had somehow never made it into public view. There were allegations of misconduct, racial profiling, and questionable stops, all buried under vague, resolved notations. Maria's stomach tightened. This was the kind of information that could blow the case wide open, but it also raised a troubling question: who had submitted it, and why now? The answer came minutes later, as a knock at her door revealed none other than Samuel Carter. His face was somber, his hands clutching a small stack of additional papers. "Your Honor," he said, stepping inside cautiously, "I think you should see this too." Maria gestured for him to sit, watching him carefully. "What is this, Mr. Carter?" Samuel placed the papers on her desk, his voice heavy with regret. "It's everything I've been sitting on for years. Complaints I heard about my son, stories I dismissed because I didn't want to believe them. But after seeing what happened in court today, I realized I can't stay silent anymore." Maria picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the detailed accounts from community members who had come forward over the years. Each story painted a damning picture of Officer Carter's behavior, patterns of bias and abuse of authority that had gone unchecked for far too long. "Why now?" Maria asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Samuel's shoulders slumped. "Because I can't live with the guilt anymore. Watching him sit there, acting like none of this matters, it's my fault. I let him believe there wouldn't be consequences. But if there's one thing I learned in all my years as a detective, it's that the truth always comes out. It's better to face it head on than let it destroy everything in its path." Maria studied him for a long moment, sensing the sincerity in his words. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Carter, but you understand this will likely change the course of the case and your son's career." Samuel met her gaze, his expression resolute. "If that's what it takes to make things right, so be it." When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Maria's calm demeanor betrayed nothing as she addressed the courtroom. "New evidence has come to light," she announced, holding up the documents. "Evidence that raises serious concerns about the conduct of Officers Daniels and Carter beyond this specific case." The officers visibly tensed, their attorney rising to object. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has not had time to review this evidence, and it's prejudicial to the case at hand." Maria raised a hand, silencing him. "I understand your concerns, Counselor, but the court has an obligation to consider all relevant information. These documents speak directly to the credibility of the officers and their actions." She handed copies of the files to both the defense and prosecution, giving them a moment to review. The gallery was hushed, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. As the attorneys flipped through the pages, murmurs began to spread. The complaints were damning, their patterns undeniable. For Maria, this was no longer just about her own experience. It was about exposing a systemic issue that had festered for far too long. But just as the room seemed to settle into the gravity of the moment, a sharp voice broke the silence. "Your Honor," Officer Daniels said, standing abruptly. His attorney tried to pull him back, but he shook the man off. "This has gone far enough. You think you can ruin our lives with a bunch of old complaints? We've done nothing but our jobs, and this circus isn't justice. It's a witch hunt." Maria's eyes locked on his, her voice steady but firm. "Officer Daniels, sit down. This is not your time to speak." Daniels hesitated, his face a mix of anger and desperation, before reluctantly returning to his seat. But the damage was done. His outburst had only confirmed what the evidence suggested: that these officers had operated with a sense of impunity for far too long. As Maria prepared to move forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was reaching a boiling point. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth had never been closer to the surface. Yet she knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The evidence might expose the officers, but it would also force the department and the community to confront uncomfortable truths. And as Maria looked out at the faces in the courtroom, She saw the weight of those truths reflected back at her. This wasn't just about two officers anymore. It was about a system on trial, a community demanding justice, and the resolve of one woman determined to see it through. But she also knew that the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Maria began to address the room. Every eye was on her, every breath held in anticipation of what would come next. The new evidence had shattered the defense's foundation, and the outburst from Officer Daniels had only deepened the cracks. But Maria wasn't done yet. She had one final move to make, one that would bring everything to a head. As this court has reviewed the evidence presented today, it is clear that we are not dealing with an isolated incident, Maria began, her voice calm but commanding. This case is a reflection of systemic issues that cannot and should not be ignored. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. To ensure justice is served, I am ordering an independent investigation into the conduct of Officers Daniels and Carter, as well as a review of the department's handling of prior complaints. This court will not tolerate a culture of impunity. The gallery murmured in approval, but Maria wasn't finished. She turned her attention to Assistant Chief Howard, who had remained silent since his earlier statements. Assistant Chief, you claimed that your department is committed to accountability. Here is your opportunity to prove it. Howard's face was a mask of neutrality, but a slight flicker of discomfort crossed his eyes. He stood, nodding stiffly. We will fully cooperate with any investigation, Your Honor. Maria nodded, satisfied for the moment, but she could feel the tension radiating from the officers. Daniels looked as though he was about to speak again, but a sharp look from his attorney kept him in check. Carter, meanwhile, seemed to have withdrawn entirely, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. It was then that Maria addressed the room once more. Before I adjourn, there is one more matter to address. I have received an anonymous tip with additional evidence regarding this case. Given its nature, I believe it is crucial to the court's understanding of the events in question. The room fell silent again as the bailiff brought forward a sealed envelope. Maria opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. What she saw made her pause, her brow furrowing slightly. Without a word, she handed the documents to the clerk, who quickly displayed them on the courtroom's screen. The images and text revealed a chain of internal emails between Officers Daniels and Carter, dated just days before Maria's arrest. The messages were chillingly candid, discussing plans to crack down on specific neighborhoods and make examples of individuals who fit the profile. The language was coded but unmistakable, dripping with bias and intent. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers, the weight of the revelation hitting everyone like a tidal wave. Daniel stood abruptly, his face red with anger. This is a setup. Those emails aren't real. Maria raised her hand, silencing the commotion. Officer Daniels, sit down. This court will not tolerate baseless accusations. The authenticity of this evidence will be verified, but based on what I see here, it appears to align with the patterns of behavior already established in this case. Daniels hesitated, his fury evident, but he slowly sank back into his chair. Carter, however, remained silent, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Maria turned her attention to Samuel Carter, who sat in the gallery with an expression of deep anguish. Mr. Carter, I need to ask you something, and I need your complete honesty. Did you know about these emails? Samuel looked up, his eyes brimming with regret. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I saw them on his computer. I confronted him about it, but he said it was just talk, nothing serious. I should have reported it then. I failed. The room was stunned into silence. Maria's expression softened for a moment, but her resolve remained firm. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Carter. Your admission may not erase what has happened, but it is a step toward accountability. Turning back to the courtroom, Maria delivered her final judgment. Given the overwhelming evidence, this court finds that the actions of Officers Daniels and Carter were not only unlawful but indicative of a deeper problem within the department. Their behavior has undermined public trust and endangered the very people they were sworn to protect. She paused, her voice steady but resolute. As such, I am recommending immediate disciplinary action against both officers and urging the district attorney to pursue criminal charges if warranted. Furthermore, I will be working with independent organizations to ensure that systemic reforms are implemented within the department. The gallery erupted in applause, the tension finally breaking as the weight of the case reached its peak. But Maria's gaze lingered on the officers, particularly Carter. He looked broken, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. As the courtroom began to empty, Maria sat back, letting out a quiet breath. Justice had been served, but she knew the fight was far from over. This case was just the beginning, a spark that would hopefully ignite real change. And as she looked out at the city beyond the courtroom's windows, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it, one case at a time.